There we go. All right, so I think we're in record. So, hey, Joel, welcome to the Modern Marketing Podcast. Super excited to have you here today.
Awesome. Hey, Adam, thanks for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. I mean, I've been following you. We got to chat a little bit beforehand before we hit the record button. And as I'm always concerned about, anytime that we have a chat before we hit record, there's so many good gems being tossed out there. So much good information that you're sharing. I figured, hey, we gotta start recording this right away so we don't miss any of it.
That's why we're here.
That's it. So why don't you, you're known as the webinar guy right now, but you're so much more than that. I mean, just as we were talking before, you've got a pretty good history of doing sales. You moved into webinars. I think you're probably the best one to tell your story though. So why don't you give me and give the listeners a bit of a recap of sort of what got you to this point and what it is that you do.
Yeah, 100%. So the last 2 years have been kind of a whirlwind in terms of the entrepreneurial world. Before I jump into that, I guess I'll give a little bit of background about where I came from and why I'm doing webinars, why I decided to specialize in webinars. So back in 2008, 2009, I graduated from college as a mechanical engineer. Decided that I was going to be an engineer. Don't know why, because my brain is not suited to be an engineer. So anyway, graduate, bachelor's in mechanical engineering, and got my first engineering job right out of college. Quickly transitioned into sales engineering when I found out that I just couldn't sit behind a desk all day and draw CAD. So I decided to start selling to those same consultants. So I grabbed a gig doing sales calls, selling that equipment. Opened up a new territory for this company, and we went from basically zero to $2 million per year in sales in about 4 or 5 years, and the majority of that growth happened within the last year and a half to 2 years. We were kind of beating our heads against the wall trying to figure out why we weren't really making the progress that we wanted, and as I was traveling around going to all my different manufacturers, we sold custom heating and cooling equipment for big construction projects, hospitals, schools, you name it.
So what do you think made the biggest difference then when you're sort of getting to the last couple of years there, all of a sudden you see this massive intake in sales?
Yeah, so as I was traveling to different manufacturers and learning about their equipment, learning about their processes so I could sell it better and get educated, we would also have them fly into our territory and give these canned sales presentations to engineers.
Yeah.
And they were awful. Engineers are just, they're not the greatest at putting together a sales presentation. Surprise, surprise.
Right.
And I knew it all along. I'm sitting in the audience and I'm like, these presentations are terrible.
We've all sat through those.
Yeah. I'm like, they're the worst. Like, I don't know how anybody thinks that we're going to get new customers by listening to these boring technical presentations.
Yeah.
So as I'm flying around the country, I'm in these airports and I'm at my layovers and whatnot, and I would go to the bookstores and I would start buying these sales presentation books because I saw that as the biggest opportunity gap because we weren't getting anything from these presentations. We'd pay $200 to bring in lunch for these engineers, and they would sit in on these presentations and they would just basically pass out because they were, they go comatose and they're not not interested.
Just eat a big lunch and then tune out the sales presentation.
Right. So I knew that was the biggest opportunity gap. So I finally started to do my own presentations because we also had a lot of inefficiencies with flying these manufacturers in from all over the country, all over the world to do a 5-person presentation. Like, well, if I want to grow this, I need to learn how to do presentations on my own.
Yeah. Got to figure out a way to scale it.
Yeah, so I started to test it out, and as soon as I started changing the presentations and doing it with my style, we saw an immediate impact in sales. I mean, I can't even express what the change was. I mean, I remember doing one presentation, and immediately afterwards, I landed a multiple 6-figure contract from that presentation because it was just completely backwards.
Yeah.
So when sales started exploding, my commissions started exploding. I'm like, oh, well, if I can sell to engineers, I can run my own business, right? It was the natural next step as an entrepreneur.
That's it. If I can do that, I can do everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I quit.
Yeah.
Literally, I quit, and I'm like, well, I'm going to do this on my own. And so I ventured into online business, and I joined a couple masterminds, and I wanted to teach engineers how to level up their career. So I recorded a whole career development course, engineering career development course, and my mentor at the time, Russell Brunson, said, you need to do this via webinar.
Yeah.
So I'm like, well, I get that. Like, I know webinars, I know sales presentations, like, sure. Well, the market that I was targeting ended up being a very broke market because my message was attracting people who were unemployed. I'm like, well, I'm going to show you how to, but my whole message was, hey, how to land. So my history was if I ever got a job interview, I'd landed an offer from 100% of my job interviews. So that was a really unique fact about me. So I'm like, well, I'm just going to teach people how to do interviews because I found there's art to that. Well, I naturally attracted unemployed, broke people. So, I had a hard time selling to broke people.
Yes. That's a huge marketing takeaway right there, right? Like, you've got to pick the segment of your audience that is willing and that is able. You've got to find the people with the money.
100%. So I struggled with that for about 4 or 5 months, dumped multiple 5 figures into that, and a lot of good learning experiences, one of which you just expressed, which is a huge valuable takeaway, is you need to make sure that you're not selling to broke people. Don't sell to broke people. You're gonna go out of business. So anyway, I ran out of money, and I called up Russell, and I'm like, Russell, I need to do phone sales for you. And I had never done phone sales in my life, but I knew that he had a high ticket program and he had tons of leads. I'm like, let me close some deals for you. And he was like, hey man, so I don't have any opportunities right now, but you should connect with this other guy. I think he's looking for a phone salesperson. So we connected with him. He was one of the other coaching students as well. And he was doing a webinar and it wasn't performing well. And so what he wanted to do is he was collecting phone numbers for all of his leads who had registered for the webinar. He goes, I want you to call all these people and follow up with them and see if you can get them to convert into sales. And he goes, well, first watch the webinar and so you know what you're talking about, and then call them. I'm like, okay. So I watched the webinar and I'm like, man, like this reminded me of back in the engineering days. Like, this is a really crappy webinar.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, hey man, can you let me take a crack at this webinar. Like, maybe I can help get you more sales without even making phone calls. He's like, sure, man, whatever. So I revised it, and within 2 weeks, we increased his sales performance by 1,400% from the webinar.
Excellent.
So it was $1,000. It was $1,000 offer. He was doing the webinar and making 1, maybe 2 sales each week, basically breaking even. And I revised that, and we did $14,000 in sales the first presentation that I revised for him, and he lost his mind. He's like, holy crap.
Yeah.
So thankfully I didn't have to do phone sales because I'm not trained in phone sales.
Yes. Yeah. That's excellent. So now you mentioned a couple terms there that I wouldn't mind drilling into. One of them we were kind of talking about before is that the high ticket item. So that's kind of a big one here. So for those that aren't familiar, high ticket typically just means higher priced opposed to sort of lower priced. Is that, do you think, a major factor, or can this work with kind of lower ticket items as well? Is the system sort of just universal, works across all industries and that?
So with his program, I wouldn't consider that high ticket. It was $1,000 offer, but and we were selling it directly on the webinar.
Okay, gotcha.
So I mean, you can definitely sell higher ticket items from a webinar. We've done that before. But with him, it was a direct-to-sale, cold traffic to the webinar, selling his $1,000 course, and then he would upsell them on the back end from there.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So that's interesting. Do you find that there's a cap? Because we've seemed to have found, at least statistically, anything above $2,000 starts to push into the high ticket thing. That's where we don't seem to have as good a results with webinars. It seems to work better with the sales call. Is that sort of what you've found as well, or? So
when you start to cap the limitation on a webinar, when people say, okay, we can't sell anything more than $2,000, that's not the first time that I've heard it. It becomes more, it's less of a webinar sales presentation, because you can sell anything at any price on a webinar. I mean, within reason. Yeah. I believe that you could sell $25,000 offers from a webinar. What matters is what's going on to warm those people up before the webinar. Your webinar is just your conversion mechanism. Right. So if you give them a warm-up sequence of a couple of weeks, I've purchased $5,000 programs from a webinar before. Mm-hmm. However, it wasn't cold traffic to a webinar and then I hand over a credit card for $5,000. It's I got on this guy's list. He sent me emails, and then we did the webinar, and he made the pitch, and ultimately I bought. So at that point, your limitation on price point has to be associated with how warm they are before they get on the webinar.
Yeah. Excellent. So that's actually a perfect lead in then. Why don't we talk real quick just about the phases? Now, obviously, we don't have time to dive into the full meat and potatoes, but what have you found is a really good system of like a pre-webinar warm-up, the webinar itself? Maybe we can work through kind of a rough outline of how to sort of structure that, and then the post-webinar. So essentially sort of the trifecta there, the pre, the actual webinar, and then the post. Is there some good takeaways that people can take if they want to start implementing this in their businesses?
Yeah. So I'm going to assume that we're talking strictly cold traffic. So people who have never heard of you before, heard of us before, and we want to do a webinar and test the sale that way. So I've spent a lot of time testing all different forms of webinars from the big gurus who say you got to segment it, segment your list 1,000 different ways. And you got to put them through 3 indoctrination videos and 3 warm-up videos and all this other stuff. And so I've tried that, and I've tried just a simple registration to webinar to sale. And the biggest thing that made the biggest impact was simplicity works. The strong majority of people do not watch the pre-warm-up videos. Segmenting my list, and never found that to be any more effective than just giving everyone the same email with a cold traffic webinar funnel. And so what I found works the best is cold traffic to the registration page. I usually have a survey on my thank you page. Like immediately, tell them, hey, this is what you're going to be learning. Take this quick survey and tell me why you're interested in watching this webinar. I will send them one additional video, which is more about, it's just an about me video because they don't know who I am. So that's the only thing that I want them to care about is figure out if you resonate with me, because 80% of you are not going to show up anyway. So if you do resonate with me, like, great, I just want to speak directly towards you. So if I can connect with them on an about me video that's no more than 2 to 3 minutes long, that's the only video I send them before the webinar. Then they hit the webinar, and afterwards I send them a bunch of follow-up emails. But the typical format is really just testimonials and what are their main objections. If it's cost, I'll talk about the cost. If it's will the system work for me, then I'll answer those. But I usually litter them with testimonials. Testimonials the most impactful, like getting sales after the webinar. And so
right now we're talking about the after the webinar process. Yeah, excellent. Okay. Yeah, testimonials, absolutely phenomenal, right? I mean, people can't, it's hard to visualize, especially with a lot of these online things that we're buying. They're so intangible. So you're relying on a result that hasn't been experienced yet. And yeah, there's almost nothing more powerful than those testimonials. Simply because it allows people to envision themselves as being that person, or to sort of identify with them. So yeah, that's awesome. So why don't we talk about then, let's move into sort of your main specialty, which is this webinar process and essentially the conversion that happens. Because I know this is where you stand head and shoulders above others, is that you've not only got the webinar, but you've got a way to take these people, and like you mentioned, a 1,400% increase in conversions there. I mean, this is huge. So let's talk a bit about how do you convert these people on the webinar? Because yeah, we've all been to those webinars that are just, oh man, they're just atrocious, and then they kind of have this awkward pause into a horrible sales pitch, and then you can just hear the crickets, and you're like, I know I've put some on like that, so I can identify. But why don't you give maybe even just for me some tips here on how do you increase the conversions? How do you better identify with the audience? What can you do to improve the sales?
So the way that I had it broken down is pretty simple. So of the webinars that I've helped build in the past year and a half, I've learned a lot of things, and we can almost always get sales right out of the gate based on crafting a compelling offer, right? If you don't have a compelling offer, it doesn't matter what's going to happen. People aren't going to buy. From a cold traffic webinar, kind of contrary to that belief is if you warm people up so much, you could put on the crappiest webinar in the world, and those people who are really, really hot are going to buy no matter what you sell, right? So how do we marry the two together, get an awesome hot traffic system and build a compelling offer? So basically there's three there's three sections to your webinar, right? You get the introduction, your content, and then your sales pitch. So what has to happen within each of those three sections is pretty simple. So I've dubbed it a very awkward acronym, but I call it the ARE webinar sales method. It's not sexy, which is kind of anti what I do because I try and sexify everything.
Yeah.
But anyway, so within the first part of your webinar, you have to establish authority, attraction, and awareness of a common problem that you're here to solve. So as the authority, you've already got that built because you're getting people to come listen to you. So you've already established yourself on top of this pillar, whether the presenter realizes it or not. But in the eyes of your audience, you are already at a place of where they want to be, or they think that you're in a place of where they want to be. So you have to recognize that and tell them that life is awesome here, because ultimately what we're trying to get them is some sort of transformation. When we do a sales pitch, we're trying to transform their lives in one way or another, whether it's helping them make more money online or helping them lose weight or helping them get a better find the partner of their dreams. I had one client who's in the relationship niche, and she was selling $7,500 relationship consulting deals. So ultimately, we want to help them with transformation. So we have to acknowledge that where they are right now in the beginning and where we are is at the top of this, top of this platform, and just acknowledge that gap and make that gap as big as possible. There's an awesome video with kind of where I learned this concept from. It was a TED Talk by Nancy Duarte. And I can send you the link.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, we'll definitely make sure to link that up in the show notes here. So
yeah, so she talks, and I kind of modeled a lot of that first part of the webinar with how she explained it, because I thought it was explained very, very well. But basically, she talks about this gap that you have to establish yourself as the presenter and the authority, and acknowledge yourself as that. She gives Steve Jobs and Martin Luther King speeches as two really, really good examples, and she breaks it down into like super, super detailed explanations. So it's like a 15-minute talk. It's definitely worth the watch.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll definitely make sure to link that one in there. So that's the authority, the attraction, awareness, and then we've got R.
So R, which is really our content, right? So after we do that, the introduction is the A aspect: authority, awareness, and attraction. Yeah. So now we need to get to the content part, which is all about relationship and rapport building. So that's what the R stands for: relationship and rapport. So I like to build webinars that are broken up. I like to build the content part of the webinar that's broken up into three sections. Now, each section talks about an existing belief that they have about the topic and how I crush that belief and get them to think about what I want them to believe. Mm-hmm. So a good example is I helped somebody build a business, or build a webinar that sold an info product on how to build a business with Amazon. Mm-hmm. So the first piece of content that I would tell them would be the system of what they do to sell products on Amazon. The second two pieces of content are all about why their prospect didn't believe that system would work for them. So it's almost, your content does all of the selling for you, right? If you do this properly, your close is very, very simple, because you're already addressing all of their objections inside of the content and crushing their existing beliefs of why it won't work for them. So the first piece of content is usually talking about the system, and then the next two pieces of content are all about addressing their biggest objections and why it won't work for them. And so I do that by telling them stories of either testimonials or stories about why I thought that way and how I viewed myself in the same position as where they are, not that long ago. So I need them to see themselves in my shoes and walking through the transformation and walking through the steps as it was when I experienced it, or when presenter experienced it. So that's all about relationship and rapport building.
Perfect. And that leads us nicely into E, which is
the exchange. Right? So rather than trying to like shove it down their throats and say you need to buy now, which is how I actually first learned how to do webinars. And it was very sleazy, very hypey. And yes, you can get a lot of sales doing that, but most people are not comfortable doing that. So I spent a lot of time studying other people who were doing awesome with webinars and kind of did a little bit of a meld between both of those styles, like the hypey style and the non-hypey style, right?
Yeah.
So if you frame your this all goes back to your content, right? If you frame your content, good enough, they aren't going to have any major objections to your offer. So you basically just say, here's what I've got for you. And I always pre-frame my offer in the beginning of the webinar too. So I say, hey, listen, if you stay until the end, I've got an offer for you. It's special only for people who are on this webinar. So, that's my hook to the end. If you stay until the end, I'll give you a special deal or whatever.
Yeah.
So I acknowledge that and say, hey, listen, did I keep my promise? I told you I'd show you how to transform your life with building a business on Amazon, right? Mm-hmm. So I just want to go through my offer real quick. If it's right for you, I want you to get it. If it's not right for you, I don't want you to get it. Plain and simple. Yeah. No skin off my back. And so I basically just go through a very, very, very top level overview of the transformation of the result they're going to get when they go through my course or when they go through my product or service or whatever I'm offering. I do not go into details. That's the number one rule in sales. You do not go into details. Most people get so caught up in how many PDFs am I giving these people? How many videos am I giving these people? If somebody told me that they wanted to sell me a $2,000 product and there was going to be 45 hours of video, I would not buy it. Right? Yeah. So when you start going into details, you immediately raise objections about why they wouldn't want to buy it. So we stay very top level, only talk about the results. How it happens, you'll find out when you get inside the training, or maybe I'll go through some of that with basic Q&A. Mm-hmm. But, if you tell them what you want them to achieve by the end of the program, as long as they put in the work, it'll happen. Right. So,
excellent. Oh, that's awesome. No, I think that's fantastic. That's a really cool point about only talking about the results. Because again, it's kind of that preaching the benefits, not the features. Don't bog people down with details. Not to mention, they're not going to have that intrinsic understanding of the product that you do, right? So if you're going to start listing off all these things, you're just going to you're going to confuse them, and then you're going to lose. So here's,
if you remember one thing about the offer, it's every time that you introduce a new component or a new feature, it's another opportunity for them to raise an internal objection in their mind of why they shouldn't buy it. So if I tell you that I've got 25 pre-recorded videos and 75 hours of content, and I kid you not, people think that when they say 75 hours of video content, they think that's a benefit, and that is that's a major objection.
Yes.
Like, there's no way in hell I'm going to go through 75 hours of video content.
Yeah.
So every time that you raise one of those, you're going to be triggering an objection into somebody's mind. Now, the challenge with webinars is that you can't see their face. Mm-hmm. So you can't conquer that objection if they were to raise it up with you, right? So you have to make sure that you stay very top level and just say, listen, when you finish module 1, you're going to have this result. When you finish module 2, you're going to have this result. When you finish the whole program, by the end of the program, you're going to have this machine that is going to give you $5 out for every dollar you put in or whatever. That's top level, right? That's top level benefits and not features. How it happens, that's what you're going to learn inside the program, but don't get bogged down because you're only going to countersell your audience.
Right. Yeah. Excellent. Actually, that was going to be a question that I had, is how do you walk that fine line between them? And I think you hit the nail on the head there. Is you take that top level overview, you show the end results, and then the how is the program. And I've heard that. So that's a fantastic gem. Joel, all right, we've covered a ton of material here, a lot of really good stuff. What's the one thing that I haven't asked you that people should know? What's the one sort of key takeaway point here that we haven't covered that's going to make all the difference?
Yeah, so great question. And this is where I'm transitioning over the next 12 months with where I want to help this audience and this crowd. So webinars have been the most effective tool for people for my clients and for my students to really scale their businesses, because the core concept of a webinar, and people get bogged down for really one primary reason. They get stuck because they think building a webinar takes a lot of time. Mm-hmm. And so where I'm moving forward in the next 12 months, I'm actually launching a membership program coming up in the next week and a half. I'm just about to finish up my pre-launch, but it's called Convert Pro, and I've built a piece of software called SlideCell that helps people craft presentations in 45 minutes or less, right? So I think webinars are great because what they do, cold traffic webinars are great because what they do is they, even though you're going to get a natural drop off from your live audience, on average right now we're seeing about a 20% attendance rate from people who register to people who show up. So people think that's a big natural objection for why they shouldn't do a webinar. And I want to challenge them to really think about who that 20% is that's showing up.
Right.
So where we're pushing people now and where I'm helping to educate people is, yes, there's a lot of opportunity with that 80% of the people who aren't showing up to your webinar. However, what that 20% represents is your hot audience, and you haven't done anything with warm up. If they're registering for a webinar and they're committing time out of their calendar to show up to an appointment, that's a hot buyer. So you now have 20% of those people who are screaming red hot potential buyers. And so we use webinars to test our offers to the hot audience, right? If they buy at the end of the webinar, and depending on whatever the conversion rate and the ROI is, we now can identify if we have a winning offer or not. If they're not buying, then we just do that. We repeat that process for the next week. And we say, okay, we're going to run traffic again, and we're going to change our offer, and we're going to rapid fire test our offers until we have a winning one. And it doesn't take long to come up with a winning offer. So I guess the one thing, to get back to your question, the one thing that we hadn't talked about was this opportunity to rapid fire test your offers, because your offer is the single most important part of any funnel. It's not your traffic. It's not your warm-up sequence. It's not how pretty your content is. It is your offer. Because if people don't believe you and your offer isn't compelling, you'll never monetize your list. And so we're using webinars as a way to rapid-fire test our offers week after week after week by grabbing those screaming red-hot buyers and those hot prospects right out of thin air without doing any sort of warm-up. So does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. No, and I couldn't agree more. That really is key. And so often we get caught up in the tactics and the tools and some of the new software that's available, and we forget about the core foundational marketing strategies, right? And that's really what the podcast is all about here, is sticking with some of those core marketing strategies, like the offer, that quintessential piece of making sure that it's gonna connect with your audience. Because otherwise what's the point if you've got something that nobody wants, or you're giving it to the wrong people, or you phrased it terribly? It doesn't matter how pretty you make it, it's still an ugly offer. So that's a gem. All right, Joel, so where can people get a hold of you? Where can they learn more? Where can they sign up for your list, maybe attend, see a little bit more about your offers and about your webinars?
So I have just a very, very basic website. You can go to the webinaragency.com. So right now, the homepage is just an opt-in to grab my $466,000 case study, which is actually the story that I told in the beginning. That 1,400% sales increase is actually that story. But I go through 6 months of numbers because I stayed on with him to see this through a major scaling effort. So it's like 10 or 15 pages, and we go through advertising numbers. We go through what did I change with the presentation? Why did I change it? What were the results? So I highly encourage people to grab that.
Perfect.
And just hop on the list. They can connect with me on Facebook or LinkedIn. I don't really have a website built yet, so they can't really learn about me unless they connect with me personally. So
perfect. That sounds good. We'll make sure to put links in the show notes to the webinar agency. We'll throw in your Facebook profile there as well, and also LinkedIn. So anybody who wants to get a hold of you can reach out that way. Awesome, Joel. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for sharing so much good information here on webinars and on offers and on how to get these conversions with the audience. Hugely appreciated. Massive pleasure having you here today.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I appreciate it.
Awesome, man. We'll stay in touch and we'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Now, I got to move the mouse.